Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi à tous.
Welcome, everyone.
Talk about ending the HIV/AIDS pandemic, mettre fin à la pandémie de VIH/SIDA.
So putting an end to the HIV/AIDS pandemic.
Et si vous
being with us this afternoon, and if you need interpretation services, there are headsets that are available at the back of the room.
You know, translations, simultaneous translation, there are headsets that are at the back there. I will say a few words in French in my introduction, but most of the talk will be delivered in English. But during the question period, if you want to ask a question in French, feel free to do so, and we will make simultaneous translation. My name is Jean Lebel, and I am the president of the International Development Research Center here, where we are, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. Stephen McGurk est avec nous. Il est le vice-président.
Stephen McGurk is Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at the IDRC. He'll be with us shortly to host the discussion with our guests. And our guests today are Dr. Frank Plummer and Dr. Anthony Fauci, who are sitting with us here on the stage.
AIDS Day. So it's fitting that we are here today to learn about the efforts to end HIV/AIDS from two people who have been leading the fights for decades. And when I say leading the fights for decades, they are here because they have received prestigious Canada Gairdner Awards this year. This is the country's most prestigious medical award recognizing the world's best and brightest biomedical researchers. In a moment, you will also hear from Dr. John Dirks, that is just sitting here in the front row, who is here on behalf of our Dr. Janet Rosen, the President and Scientific Director of the Gairdner Foundation, who could not be with us today. And for those of you that are familiar with Gairdner, Ottawa, Health, Global Health, everyone knows John because John was the President and Scientific Director for the Gairdner Foundation until May of last year, and I think you were in that position for, 23 years? 23 years. So welcome again to IDRC. Comme bon nombre d'autres.
As many of you already know, the IDRC is a crown corporation which plays an important role in work in foreign affairs and development. We invest in knowledge, innovation, and solutions to improve living standards for people across the world. We were one of the first agencies to fund international research on HIV/AIDS. When this research at that time was not seen as a priority, it wasn't the presence of the disease was not even recognized. Dr. Fauci and Dr. Plummer were involved in this, and we were very lucky to be able to talk with Dr. Plummer in this area in the 80s.
The center is financing research work and is privileging an approach that is based on the fact that, we need to do research, we need to build the political will, we need to work with the health system that is present and that we need to strengthen, and we need also to work with the actor at the social, economic, as well as medical level to get rid of some of these diseases or have better treatment for the population that are affected. En fait, parmi les nombreux
of the many research projects on HIV/AIDS that the IDRC has funded, as I was telling you, we worked with Dr. Plummer. We worked in cooperation with the University of Nairobi and the University of Manitoba as well. The Gairdner Award is not just designed to recognize leading scientific research. The Gairdner Foundation also facilitates travel for current recipients and former recipients also, so that people can find out about their work across Canada. The commitment to exchange knowledge and experience through the Gairdner Award is the reason why we're here today, in fact.
Hear from Dr. Frank Plummer. Dr. Plummer received the Canada Gairdner Wightman Awards for his groundbreaking research in HIV transmission in Africa and his leadership at the Canadian National Microbiological Laboratory with pivotal roles in SARS, influenza, and Ebola epidemics. Dr. Plummer is a special advisor to the Chief Public Health Officer at the Public Health Agency of Canada, distinguished professor at the University of Manitoba, and the former scientific director of the National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg. He led the development of the Canadian AIDS Control Program, which we learn about shortly. Then we will hear from Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Fauci received the Canada Gairdner Global Health Award for his many pioneering contribution to our understanding of HIV infection and his extraordinary leadership in bringing successful treatment in the developing world. Dr. Fauci has been for 32 years the director of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. In his more than 3 decades in this role, Dr. Fauci has overseen pioneering research devoted to preventing, diagnosing, and treating infectious and immune-mediated diseases. In his presentation, Dr. Fauci will discuss the extraordinary progress in the 35-year global fight against HIV/AIDS, a plague of modern time. Together, Dr. Plummer and Dr. Fauci will provide a fascinating window into the effort to end the HIV/AIDS pandemic. But before we hear from them, I'm going to ask my good friend, Dr. John Dirks, to come at the front and say a few words. John served for 23 years at Gairdner, but has also been the director of nephrology at McGill University, head of the Department of Medicine at UBC, and Dean of Medicine at the University of Toronto, and Dean Rector of the Aga Khan University in Pakistan. So he's extremely well placed to introduce the speaker of today, and it's an honor for me to leave you the podium. John, welcome to IDRC again. Dr. Plummer, Dr. Fauci, welcome to IDRC, and looking forward to your talk. Thank you very much. John.
Well, I want to thank Jean Labelle and IDRC for developing a tradition that every year the Gairdner winners, usually the Canada Gairdner Global Health Laureate, comes here and speaks to IDRC and others involved in the academic health field here in Ottawa. Gairdner's had a long history, starting off in 1959 when a stockbroker started it, but he put 2 principles on the table for the Gairdner Awards, which have become Canada's leading international prize. And the 2 principles were to open it to the world, and so that over the years, the awardees have come from 15 countries. And the second thing was, let the scientists pick them. So it was never a political process. And over the years, I think one of the things that Gairdner is known for is, in fact, the quality of its selection. And we spend a lot of time making sure that the adjudication of our 3 kinds of prizes is carried out at an international level so that we have international people in all our committees. We're known for many years for the discovery type prize, like the person who defines the first stem cell, that sort of thing. And that has been, we give 5 awards. And this year it's very interesting as we're talking about infections. This year it was given for that new technique, CRISPR, the way in which you can edit genes. But where did that come from? It came out of biology, out of the natural world, in an immune system that bacteria had to fight off viruses. And now this has been refined to be used as a gene editing technique, which can already being used in various fields, the plant biology, the animal veterinary world, and to some extent in the future in human beings. So this is a real advance, and it was great to have those 5 people. But it was equally great at our dinner on October 27th in Toronto to have honor the 2 people here today, because they represented another side of the coin, the one you're seeing today, for 2 people who have made outstanding advances in infectious disease and in every domain. So Frank, with the Canada Gairdner Wightman Award for his leadership and his science and his work in Africa, has been an exceptional leader, and Tony, as John described, equal to the same on the world scale with many discoveries dealing with HIV. But one thing John didn't have a chance to talk about their influence. So Frank has influenced Canadian medicine, Canadian biology a great deal through his work, but also that leadership of the national laboratories. So we never had national microbiology laboratories of that kind. That was a huge advance. And if I say that Dr. Tony Fauci's influence has extended to some 250 meetings with congressional committees over the years and advising 5 presidents, you can get an idea how influence coming out of laboratory people can involve and rise to public policy. So it's great to be here, and I look forward to the next stages of the Gairdner Awards, but I'm particularly looking forward to the 2 talks this afternoon. And I have some files. I'll pass them around for those who take a file.
Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to ask the first of our 2 speakers to speak. Frank, you have priority of place. If I can call you Frank.
You can call me Frank.
I can call you Frank.
Well, thanks. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. Great to be at another Gairdner event of many. I'm going to talk to you today, if I can figure out how to change the slides, about the partnership between, nope, wrong slides. Those are Dr. Fauci's slides. Oh, but I thought I emailed it to you. No. Okay. I'll just wing it, I guess. I thought I emailed it. Had some problems because I had a couple of pictures that were kind of large, and the email system wouldn't take it. So anyway, I'm Frank Plummer from the University of Manitoba. I've been with the University of Manitoba since I was 17 years old. So it's kind of a home for me. I graduated from there in medicine way back when. And I trained in infectious diseases there. I got into infectious diseases because my mentor, Dr. Alan Ronald, asked me what I was doing next year while I was on an infectious disease rotation. And I said, well, Alan, I didn't really have firm plans, and thought maybe I'd do nephrology or cardiology, but also maybe infectious disease would be a possibility. So he said, come and see me on Monday. So I went to see him on Monday, and he offered me a job straight away as an infectious disease trainee. During the meeting, he said, Frank, would you be interested in going to Nairobi? And I said, oh, yeah, what's going on in Nairobi? And he was, and that was in 1980, he was starting a project in Kenya looking at a disease called chancroid, which is a nasty bacterial sexually transmitted disease which causes ulcers on the genitalia. And so I hadn't done anything interesting in my life. I'd been sort of finished high school, pre-med, medicine, internship, residency. So I thought, yeah, this would be kind of a diversion. So I went to Nairobi for a year, and it was an epiphany in my life. It basically resulted in a career change. I had planned to go to Seattle to work with Larry Corey, who's famous herpes virus researcher on herpes viruses. But when I went to Nairobi, I found myself in a sexually transmitted disease clinic looking after 600 patients a day with one other doctor. So it's a pretty busy place. And I came to 2 conclusions after that first year. One was that you couldn't solve this problem by treating one patient at a time. You had to figure out other ways of doing it, whether that's creating vaccines or changing people's behavior or whatever it is. The second was that research was the way to achieve that. And I was in Nairobi for just over 11 months, and as a result of that work, we published 12 papers in journals like New England Journal, Lancet, so on, which is pretty good for 12 months. So I thought this research is easy, right? You can do it very quickly. So I went back to Manitoba for a year after saying no to Seattle, and then went to Atlanta for a year where they tried to change me into a molecular microbiologist, which didn't work. And then I was offered 2 jobs after that training. One was to go to the University of Saskatchewan to head up their infectious disease program. The other was to go back to Nairobi to lead what was then a nascent research program between the University of Manitoba and the University of Nairobi. So I chose the latter, and I went for 2 years and ended up staying for 17 years. So I was there as a visiting scientist, and I think I was the longest visitor they ever had. They were glad to get rid of me when I left. So the first thing we started to do was to work on gonorrhea. That was my kind of research niche. We're still doing work on chancroid, figuring out how to treat it, and we developed single-dose therapy for chancroid, and ultimately, after a decade or so, we eradicated that disease from Nairobi, which was an important achievement. But our work on gonorrhea led us to look at a disease called ophthalmia neonatorum, which is an eye infection of newborn children that can cause blindness. It's caused by Neisseria gonorrhea and chlamydia trachomatis. So we first did some studies on the epidemiology and what was causing this problem. And in Kenya, at first, they denied that there was a problem at all. But we found out that about 15% of babies had a newborn eye infection. The second thing we did was to show that a drug called ceftriaxone was effective as treatment for gonococcal ophthalmia neonatorum. And the second thing we did was to show that prophylaxis, putting tetracycline ointment in the eye of newborns, was as effective as what was being used then, which was silver nitrate, which was a nasty chemical and can in itself cause a lot of toxic reactions to the eye. And that's become standard of care around the world now. And I'm proud to say that work was supported by IDRC. They actually built us a clinic in order to get this work underway. But then HIV, we started to do work on immunity to gonorrhea in sex workers. And we had the idea that some sex workers might be immune to gonorrhea because they're infected many, many times. But along came a research fellow from Seattle by the name of Joan Kreis, who insisted, against the advice of her mentor and me, wanted to study HIV in these sex workers. So we did a study, and what she found in her study, which is a landmark study, was that 2/3 of these women were HIV infected. And there was no knowledge at all that HIV was a problem in that part of the world. So our gonorrhea study continued, but it quickly became an HIV study as well. And we were able to, this was at a time when, if you remember back to like 1984, 1985, this was at a time that it was thought that women didn't get HIV, or it was very difficult for them to get HIV. It was a disease of men, gay men, and hemophiliacs. So we asked the question, well, how is it that these 65% of these women got HIV if it's hard for women to catch? And we were able to show a number of things. One was that conventional sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea and chlamydia promoted the acquisition of HIV. And we're also able to demonstrate that we could, using appropriate community-based, peer-led safe sex education, could get women to use condoms at very high rates, which is something that was unheard of among sex workers in that part of the world at the time. And that technology has been exported around the world, really. It's been taken to India, to Cambodia, to Thailand, elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's preventing many thousands of HIV infections. The next thing we turned our eyes to was female-to-male transmission of HIV. There was really nothing known about it at that point, and we wanted to understand the frequency of female-to-male transmission of HIV and what potential risk factors there might be. So we developed a study in which we looked at men who had acquired sexually transmitted diseases from these sex workers that we knew so much about, and at that point, about 90% of them had HIV infection. And we reasoned that the chances of men who had sex with them being exposed to HIV was pretty close to 100%, so we might be able to estimate the rate of transmission. And we were able to do that. But what we found, two other things that were pretty important. One was that men that acquired a genital ulcer disease, like chancroid, were much more likely to get HIV than men who had gonorrhea or chlamydia. But the more important thing was that uncircumcised men were much more susceptible to HIV than circumcised men. There was about a 50% protective effect. And it took about... there was a lot of disbelief about that. It took a long time to translate that into policy. It took 17 years. But after 3 randomized clinical trials, some of them supported by Dr. Fauci's agency, showed that, yes, indeed, there's like a 50 to 60% protective effect if men are circumcised in terms of their susceptibility to HIV. And now it's a standard of intervention for HIV throughout the world, but it's particularly being applied in Africa with the help of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We also took our interventions in sex workers, showing that we could get women to use condoms using the appropriate community-based approaches and treating their STDs, and funded by CETA, which Ute, once our program officer, is sitting here. We took that approach and expanded it to a number of clinics in Nairobi, to 3 clinics, and we had about 10,000 people involved. And we were able to show a reduction in the community prevalence of HIV using this approach. That my successors, Dr. Larry Gelman and Dr. Stephen Moses and Dr. Joshua Kamani, have taken that approach and now advanced it further, now funded largely by PEPFAR, which Dr. Fauci will talk to you about. We now have about 30,000 patients in care and care or prevention. And for the first time ever, we've identified gay men who are sex workers in Nairobi. And that's like a revolution, because it was pretty much denied that there was homosexuality at all in Kenya. So for the first time, men are being included in these approaches. I guess the final thing I'll mention to you is that as one of our findings in the early days of HIV back in 1985 was that women who were HIV infected or women who were not HIV infected had a longer time in sex work than women who were HIV infected, which is backwards. If you know anything about epidemiology, it should be the other way around. So we came up with the hypothesis that in some way these women were resistant to HIV infection, went on to prove that through a number of different analyses, and have been working for the last 13 years to try to understand what's behind this resistance to HIV infection. And we've shown that there are some genetic influences. There's clustering of this phenomena of resistance in families, so sisters and mothers and daughters and so on are more likely to be HIV uninfected if they're related to an HIV uninfected women. And that translates to their male relatives and to relatives who are not involved in sex work. And that there are genes that seem to be related to this. And finally, that this phenomena of HIV resistance correlates with immune responses to HIV of many different kinds, and that we're hopeful that this will help us to develop clues for an HIV vaccine in the future. And I'd like to close just by thanking IDRC once again for all the support they've given us. A number of the studies I mentioned were funded by IDRC. We also had lots of support from CETA. and lots of support from CIHR and lots of support from the NIAID. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Plummer. I think we'll take questions at the end to both of you, if that's all right with you. Dr. Fauci, please, might I turn to you?
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to talk, as you see on this first slide, and I hope to leave the message with you in my brief presentation, that the ability to end the HIV/AIDS pandemic as we know it today is truly an achievable goal, that we have gotten to the point of that feasibility because of the scientific effort that has been put into this disease, which is now 35 years old. So let me first talk a little bit about the beginnings, because this is a really very interesting story as a lesson of how, if you marshal both public health and biomedical research endeavors, you can address in an effective way even the most historic of all outbreaks. This is a picture of the MMWR, the weekly publication from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the NIH, and is really the first month where I got involved in HIV. I would say HIV research, but really at that time I was really spending my 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, taking care of desperately ill patients. And that was the first report in the summer of 1981, first of 5 gay men in Los Angeles who presented with an unusual pneumonia. It was curious, A, because they were all gay, and B, because this is a pneumonia that is only seen in people with dramatically immunosuppressed immune systems. We didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it was, and I thought it was an aberrancy and a fluke until 1 month later, when the next MMWR appeared, shown here on July 3rd of 1981, now of 26, curiously, all gay men, all previously healthy, who now had not only pneumocystis pneumonia, but Kaposi sarcoma, and not only from Los Angeles, but from New York City and from San Francisco. And that was the beginning, not that those were the first cases. Those were the first recognized cases. So what happened is, you fast forward now 35 years, and you could see historically, this is one of the most devastating pandemics in the history of our civilization, with about 80 million people having been infected, about 40 million having died, 36 million living with HIV infection, and we are still, though there is some complacency, in the middle of a major outbreak with 1.1 million deaths and 2.1 million new infections. The New England Journal of Medicine asked me on World AIDS Day last year, December the 1st, every year is World AIDS Day. I helped to commemorate World AIDS Day yesterday at the United States Capitol in one of the congressional buildings, and I spoke about some of the things I'm going to speak to you over the next couple of minutes. But anyway, the New England Journal asked me to delineate in a concise commentary why I thought, since I have been talking about this now for a couple of years, that there is a feasibility to ending the AIDS pandemic. And my response was to follow the science, because the science has given us the tools to do this, and I'm going to tell you about those. If you look at each of these yellow boxes of the scientific advances over the last 35 years from that first report of AIDS, we didn't call it AIDS then, we called it gay-related immunodeficiency, because we incorrectly thought that this was a disease of gay men, when it was probably been going on in Africa, mostly heterosexual, for several years before then. I could spend my entire 10 minutes or so on each of the boxes here, but I want to point out just one, and that is the arena of treatment. Because when I said follow the science, what happened from those early years when the only thing we could do was essentially metaphorically put Band-Aids on hemorrhages, because we didn't know what the etiologic agent was, and we certainly did not have any treatment. But once the agent was discovered in 1983 by Montagnier and Barré-Sinoussi in Paris, and then shown to be the etiologic agent in 1984 by Gallo and his colleagues, this is what we had. We had me, and this is I show this almost as a joke to myself. This is a picture of me 35 years ago with not a single gray hair. So this is what working for 35 years on HIV can do for you. But seriously, what this shows is that the patients who came to us were advanced, and the median survival of my patients at that time was anywhere from 8, 12, 15 months, and virtually all of them died. It was really the darkest period of my life, which is an imprint on me that I will never forget, even to today, when I still every week take care of HIV-infected individuals. But here's where the science came in. When the virus was discovered, the replication cycle, which I won't go into any detail, shows the viruses replicating in a typical vulnerable cell, the CD4 positive T cell. The beauty of studying the molecular virology is that it identified very vulnerable targets for the development of antiretroviral drugs, shown here in their different classes on this slide. The first drug was screened and tested and shown to be effective in 1986 and published in 1987, approved by the United States FDA in 1987. And then over the next several years, combinations of drugs were developed, shown here on this slide, which has completely transformed the lives of HIV-infected individuals. Because right now, if a 20-year-old person came into that same room where you saw me 35 years ago and said that they were recently exposed, and I showed that they were infected, and I put them on a combination of drugs which can be given with one pill that contains 3 drugs, I could look them in the eye and honestly tell them that if they take their medications each day regularly, that they would live an additional 50 years. Not each and every one of them, obviously, because they'll develop other diseases, but as a group, the life expectancy is now almost, not quite, but almost normal. If you pause for a moment and think about that, this is one of the most important advances from a disease that was completely unknown to the point of totally transforming their lives. Again, it was the science that did this. Now with the PEPFAR program, the Global Fund, a variety of other ways to get drugs to the developing world, there are 18 million people receiving antiretroviral therapy throughout the developing and developed world. It should be pointed out that 90% of all infections with HIV are in the developing world, and 67% of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a vulnerable part of the global population that is not rich in resources. However, the results then get back to the slide I showed you a couple of minutes ago. Since 2003, there's been a decline of 43% in deaths. That has led to now a recommendation from the WHO that everyone who's infected with HIV should be put on antiretroviral therapy. Before, it was wait until the immune system starts to decline. We know now that the longer you wait, the more trouble you get into. And the reason you should treat everyone is that not only will you save their lives, but by bringing the level of virus so low in the body, you dramatically block the probability that they will infect someone else. So you're left with a very interesting situation, which treatment is treatment, but treatment is also prevention. And that has led to really the point that I'm making. This now becomes an implementation issue. So now that we have these tools, how do you implement that? The way to do it is a very aggressive way, which is linked to the healthcare system. So now all of a sudden, your ability to end an epidemic is intimately linked to the infrastructure of healthcare, because theoretically and practically, the foundation for any treatment and prevention is HIV testing. What do we mean? You test everybody. There's one or two outcomes. They're either positive or they're negative. If they are positive, they go into what we call a care continuum. Very briefly, a care continuum is from the point you're infected to the point that you're on therapy and that your viral load is suppressed so low that your life is saved and you won't infect anybody else. The difficulty is that there are vulnerable gaps in that continuum, because first, if you're infected, you got to be recognized that you're infected. If you recognize your infection, you got to be in care. If you're in care, you've got to be on therapy. If you're on therapy, you've got to suppress the virus. That has led to the care continuum, which UNAIDS has come up with a target, which might be a little bit unrealistic, of what we call 90-90-90. What does that mean? If you haven't heard of it, it means that if you do a simple mathematical model, if you diagnose 90% of the people who are infected in the world, you put 90% of them on treatment, and 90% of those are virally suppressed. 90% of 90% of 90% is 73%. And what would happen that if you could get 73% of the people suppressed in their viral load, the mathematical model will show you that the trajectory of the epidemic will do this purely on the basis of treatment alone. So how's the world doing? Not so good, because right now, if you look globally at all the countries, we're only at 38%, as shown on the far right-hand side. The United States, interestingly, isn't doing as well because we, unlike Canada, have a very good but somewhat fragmented healthcare system where not everybody has access, particularly since we have a very heterogeneous population in the United States. So we're started off at 30%. We're now up to about 50%. Now, if you look at some countries in Africa, they're doing very well. Botswana is almost there at 70%. But Botswana is a relatively rich country. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is way, way down, as are a number of other countries in the region and in South America. But some highly developed countries like Sweden are doing very well. They have a relatively homogeneous population. They have a good healthcare system. They're already up at 78%. So if they keep at that, their epidemic is going to go way down and essentially be over as an epidemic. You're not going to ever eliminate every HIV infection, but you're going to go way down. Let me quickly go to prevention. Now we have very good prevention tools. However, prevention has been a big stumbling block. We still get about 2 million new infections each year. The United States, and I have to say this as an American, that the United States does very badly on this. We've had 40,000 new infections each year for the last 15 years, and we've never gone below 40,000. In the early years, it was 120 to 140,000 new infections. Then it went way down, but it stopped at 40,000. And the reason is the accessibility to the people who are getting infected, which is disproportionately African-American men who have sex with men, is much, much more disparately in that population. So what do we do now? We have what's called a prevention continuum. Years ago, if someone came in who was at risk, practicing risk behavior, and we tested them and they were negative, we'd say, wow, you're lucky. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Goodbye. And we'll see you some other time. We don't do that anymore because if you're in a risk category, we follow you as closely as if you were infected, namely counseling and risk stratification, providing you with a combination of prevention modalities, retaining you, and adhering to support. This is a ring schematic diagram of all of the different types of prevention modalities that we have. Early on, we had very low tech, use of condoms, needle exchange, behavior modification. Now what we've done is that we've interdigitated things such as treatment as prevention, which is just what I told you. If you treat somebody, you can prevent them from getting infection transmitted to their sexual partner. It really works. So the question I ask with this slide, if you increase the percentage of people who are on therapy and suppress their viral load, what happens to the incidence of infection in your city or in your country? In Baltimore, as suppression goes up in blue, incidence goes down in red. In Rwanda, as the number of people who have viral suppression go up, the incidence goes down. There's also pre-exposure prophylaxis. Now, what is that? Pre-exposure prophylaxis means if you get somebody who's at high risk and who clearly is not doing the things you need to do to prevent infection, And one of the things I learned, I didn't learn it in medical school, but I certainly learned it as I started to devote my career to HIV, that when it comes to sexual activity, it is very, very difficult to modify behavior, particularly when there are other things like drugs and alcohol that get in there. The risks are high. So we've developed now what's called pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is very interesting. That is a single pill that contains 2 drugs that if you take it every single day, you can decrease by more than 98% the likelihood that you actually will be acquiring HIV infection. Now, that shouldn't be a license to go and have risky behavior, but it can dramatically decrease the probability that you're going to get infected. We've done this in San Francisco, and the results are astounding. San Francisco is a model city in the United States. The infection rate is going way down. We did a study that we helped fund with the city of San Francisco, in which we took more than 1,200 men, mostly gay men, not all, and put them on daily PrEP for a year and a half. There was not a single infection among them, whereas comparably matched people who weren't on PrEP had 82 new infections. The fast tracking to end the HIV/AIDS means we need more testing, promptly put people on therapy, immediate antiretroviral therapy for ART, pre-exposure prophylaxis, and other HIV prevention services. I want to end with this final slide, which is somewhat of a humorous story. I have to go to a lot of official dinners in Washington. They're great, except you kind of get tired of them after a while. And I was sitting down at one of these dinners next to the editor of the editorial page of the Washington Post. And he was trying to eat his calamari or whatever he was trying to eat. And I was just talking to him about how we could end the AIDS epidemic. So I think in order to shut me up, he said, all right, why don't you write an editorial in the Washington Post and I'll make sure it gets published. And that's what I did right here in January of 2016. I say that somewhat facetiously, but what I said in that editorial is that we don't have any more excuses because we actually have the tools to end the AIDS epidemic as we know it. We still don't have a vaccine. We still don't have a cure. And clearly a vaccine would be the nail in the coffin of the epidemic. But if we implement the tools we have now, we can end the epidemic. And I think as historic as the epidemic is, I think that history will judge us very, very poorly if we don't implement the tools that we have. So I'll stop right there and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, extraordinary presentations. Thank you both. Let me start by posing the question to both of you that you raised, Dr. Fauci. You've been the principal architect of the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief that has literally saved millions of lives and really has been an extraordinary contribution. So not only a working scientist who's made critical developments in the understanding of HIV/AIDS, but a research manager who's managed one of the most important institutions in the entire NIH, and an incredible contributor to saving millions of lives through your work at NIH, but also particularly through developing PEPFAR. As you showed us, 56% of Africans on average that are HIV positive are now being treated. And as you said, a number of African countries, Congo, are much lower than that. Some are higher. But still, even an average of 56%, it doesn't come close to the levels we need to actually reduce transmission and, of course, to save people's lives who need the treatment. Worldwide treatments now cover 21 million people out of the 36 million. We have a long ways to go still. developing countries where most of the problem is now found. Granted, there are problems in Canada, Sweden, the United States as well, but most of the problem is in countries with health systems that are not what they need to be. What can the world do to extend treatment coverage towards levels where HIV-positive people have access to treatment and to those levels that dramatically reduce transmission? We'll start with you, Dr. Fauci.
Well, I think there are several things that could be done, but one of the things would apply broadly beyond HIV/AIDS, and that is attention to the development of sustainable health systems. And I think that's something that has been neglected both by the host countries involved, but also by the developed nations, the rich nations that have come in and addressed different problems over the decades, be it malaria, be it tuberculosis or what have you, is that there's not enough attention paid on sustainable systems as opposed to what we call as parachute science, where you parachute in, you do your thing, and then you leave. There is enough disease burden, if you look at throughout the world, and there will be emerging and re-emerging infections. But there are a number of things to do, but probably the most important is to pay attention to the development of sustainable health systems so that you can access the people who need both prevention and treatment. And also, there's the sustained commitment to global health as opposed to responding in a reactive way whenever there's an outbreak, like we did with Ebola, like we're doing in the Western Hemisphere right now with Zika. We need to have a plan to have things in place before they happen.
Yeah. Dr. Plummer, you've been deeply responsible for helping build capacities in some of the most difficult places to work in Nairobi, building capacities more broadly in Kenya, in India, to actually respond to these HIV positive populations, but also for prevention programs and, of course, for broader programs of response and preparedness in a whole range of infectious disease. Let me ask you the same question. How do we build these health systems to make them more capable of both preparing for and responding to these crises?
Well, I think Tony's exactly right in terms of there's been not enough attention to building health systems. There's a lot of what we call vertical programs. Some for malaria, some for GV, some for HIV.
We're having a problem with your mic, so we'll just see if we can fix that. And I do apologize that we didn't get your presentation, Dr. Plummer. Yeah.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Now it's
there you go.
That was good. No, I would totally agree with Tony that there's been reluctance on the part of many development agencies to invest in health systems in developing countries. They'll invest in tuberculosis or malaria or HIV, but not in developing a system as a whole. And that, system as a whole includes infrastructure, buildings, clinics, people, doctors and nurses, maybe even transportation. So I think that needs to be addressed in a comprehensive way, and hopefully by partnerships between many different development agencies to build the system, because it is about a system. Even though you have all these great HIV treatments, it's kind of seems to me to be a pretty big discrepancy if you have all these HIV drugs in the cupboard, but there's nobody there to hand them out, or there's no treatment for malaria or no treatment for tuberculosis. So the whole system needs to be strengthened and worked on. And it also takes sustained commitment. You can't do it for 3 years or 5 years. It needs to be a decades-long effort. And it's not an easy thing to do, but it needs to be done. And also, I would say that governments in these developing countries need to pay more attention to their own public health systems, which they often don't do very well.
We are seeing progress on this, though. I mean, I was struck in the response to the Ebola crisis in the three affected West African countries that some of the key participants, both from other West African countries that had been involved in building capacity exercises around a future AIDS vaccine, were directly involved in the vaccine trials around Ebola. Equally, the groups that Peter Piot and Gary Kobinger had worked with in Kinshasa, that had worked on Ebola cases for decades in southern Africa, were also involved in the vaccine trials and the emergency responses in West Africa. So clearly, both on an individual, institutional, and country level, there is increasing engagement with health systems. 2 weeks ago, I was in Vancouver at the Global Health Symposium, where health systems strengthening is the key element of this global symposium, and there were some 50 different African countries represented, and South Asian countries as well. Clearly, the dial is moving in positive directions around building health systems. So we can increase coverage for HIV populations, and we can reduce transmission. But even so, Dr. Fauci, you pointed yourself to the limits of doing that, and that we will need some prophylaxis. We'll need some kind of way to change behavior. Again, what can we do to reduce the rates of new infections? Is it really conceivable that we could adopt in Dr. Plummer, to you, in sex worker communities in Nairobi or Mumbai, could we adopt prophylaxis treatments? Or would we need to, perhaps? But should we be doing these kinds of programs as well?
Well, I think one of the things that is really an impediment to anything we want to do is the prevalence and still lingering of stigma associated with HIV infection. That's really very, very important. It's important throughout the world. It's intensively seen in certain developing countries. I mean, Frank can tell you a little bit about that in places like Kenya and other places. But even in the United States, it's very interesting in the United States that the African Americans comprise 12 to 13% of the United States population. If you look at the new HIV infections that occur in the United States, the 40,000 a year that stay that way, of the total, 45% of them are African Americans. That's a terrible disparity. Most of those are African American men who are either gay or bisexual. And one of the reasons, there are several complicated reasons, but one of the reasons why they're not accessed as much is due to the stigma, the triple whammy, being gay in a macho society that doesn't tolerate gay men as well as in the white society. And we've had a terrible time getting the community to embrace these people, to get them to feel comfortable about coming in to be tested. Because just as I showed you on that slide, the first step towards helping to prevent in an uninfected person and to treat in an infected person is to get tested. And if you get tested and you're infected, then all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of stigma against you. So that's something that really needs to be worked on everywhere. But I can tell you in the United States, it's still a problem.
I certainly see it's a problem in Canada, too, although I think the problem's obviously extremely contextual. Downtown East Side in Vancouver, many of the clinics for the drug users and sex workers that is such a concentration of HIV-positive peoples are very difficult for people to access because there's a lot of police presence. Because it's a crime-heavy neighborhood, there's a lot of police presence right around where the health clinics are. So most of the drug users and sex workers who need to use the clinics will not go anywhere near them. So clearly there are a whole range of institutional issues that we're going to have to deal with. Frank?
With regard to your question about sex workers and PrEP, we're beginning to get demands from these barely literate sex workers in poor communities in Nairobi for particularly post-exposure prophylaxis, but also pre-exposure prophylaxis. So they know about it. They seem to be willing to take the treatment. Whether they'll take it on a consistent basis, I don't know. But I think the door is open.
And do you see a combination of cheaper, faster diagnostics, smarter combinations of cognitive training, better design of drugs and vaccines that will actually accelerate movements towards greater treatment and reduction of transmission?
The best city in the United States for that is San Francisco. The west coast of the United States usually does things first, for those of you who know the United States, and then it sort of works its way back east. In San Francisco, they have a program called the RAPID program. And they're very aggressive in making it very difficult for someone to escape the net of prevention. So they go out into the community with vans, and they get homeless people in gay bars, and they go in, and just regarding the technology you're saying, they have a rapid test. So they'll go in, and they'll test somebody, and they won't leave until they find out whether they're positive or negative. If they're positive, they give them a bag of a month's worth of antiretrovirals, and they give it to them, and then they give them a prescription to fill it. And then they take their cell phone number. And if they don't come back in a month to get it refilled, they'll call them up. If they don't have a cell phone, they'll give them a cell phone for free to be able to do that. And they are just, don't let them escape. And right now, if you look at what's happened, that the infection rate in San Francisco has gone way down because of that. The other thing that you mentioned is to make it easier for people to do prevention modalities. So we're working on now a long-acting injectable drug called cabotegravir, which you don't have to take a pill every single day. You can get an injection, hopefully every couple of months. And that would take away the burden of having to take a pill. So we're working on the technical things, faster diagnostics, getting people on therapy quicker, and longer-acting prevention.
Obviously, to accompany these very aggressive social engineering, behavioral change types of outreach efforts. Frank, have you seen any of these kinds of programs in shape in many of the communities that you've worked in Africa, in South Asia? That you're particularly think are effective?
Well, I think using technology is like cell phone technology, for instance. We have a program in Nairobi that uses, we've discovered that almost everybody in poor communities has some access to a cell phone. They may not have one of themselves, but their neighbor has one, or their parent has one, or whatever. So you can use text messaging to help increase adherence to therapy. Remind people that they need to come to the clinic to pick up their prescription or pick up their drugs or whatever it is. So I think those kind of technological solutions, what seems to be taken to another level in San Francisco, are going to help all of this.
Yeah. So let me turn to infectious disease. Both of you have spent your lives both doing the science, being doctors against and managing very large and complex laboratories and research institutions. What should we be doing? We had this question at lunch. What should we be doing as societies to prepare for, that we're not doing, to prepare for a pandemic infectious disease? Let me start with you, Dr. Plummer, first.
Well, I think you have to keep it at the forefront of your mind that this is going to happen again, whether it's Zika or another Ebola in Africa or another H1N1 pandemic. It's going to happen. So you can't lose attention to these problems. And that means, continuing to invest in laboratory infrastructure, in epidemiologists, in all the things that are needed for response, because we don't know where the next one's coming. They often surprise us, like H1N1 was a surprise since it seems to have originated in Mexico rather than everybody was looking at Asia. So you don't know what it's going to be, you don't know where it's going to come from, and you don't know if it's going to be totally new or something reasonably familiar like H1N1 was. So it's having a consciousness about preparedness and ensuring you have the capacity to respond needs to be top of mind, and the people that make funding decisions need to be reminded of that periodically. And we have
like a good disaster.
No, well, that's one of the things about epidemics is that they help to remind people that we have a risk.
And Dr. Fauci, you've been one of the most effective global spokespersons around infectious disease issues. What can we do as societies, not just governments and funding programs, but what can we do more broadly as citizens to be prepared?
Well, I think as citizens to be prepared is to support the things that Frank is saying that the government should do. Because if the citizens are lackadaisical about it and never get energized except when they get frightened about epidemics, it's the worst way to respond is to respond after it's happened as opposed to before. I've testified before our Congress an awful lot. And one of the most difficult things to do is to get resources for something that hasn't happened yet. And one of the things that we're pushing for in the United States is to have a global health emergency fund the way we have a hurricane, flood, earthquake fund. What happened in the United States with Zika, if the Canadians haven't followed that in the newspapers,
it was all over our newspapers.
It's a bit of a disgrace. President Obama asked Tom Frieden and I to brief him in the Oval Office in January of 2016 when it became clear that Zika was a serious problem in the Americas. So we laid out a plan, and we met with him several times. I must have met with him like 8 or 9 times over that period of time. He laid out a plan for public health and scientific vaccine and diagnostics. And the whole thing came to $1.9 billion. The president in February asked the Congress to appropriate the $1.9 billion. And every month we would go by and have to take money away from Ebola. The first thing we did was to take money from malaria and TB to start the Zika vaccine. Then when we ran out of that money, we had to raid the Ebola fund. And we asked the Congress yet again, we need the money. They didn't give us the money. Then when the Ebola money went out, we had to take money away from cancer and heart disease till finally we have the vaccines going. And only at the end of September of 2016 did they give us $1.1 billion. So he asked for it in February. They gave it to us in September. And we had to raid every other account. If we had a fund that was there that you could draw on in an emergency, we wouldn't be always chasing after a crisis as opposed to being able to respond. So that's one thing that we could do.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn it to the floor for questions from you. And while I wait for people to go to the mic, well, I don't even have to wait. Isn't that wonderful? Please, I'll turn immediately to you. Please tell me who you are and then go direct your question.
My name is Masha Sema. I'm a Canadian Science Policy Fellow, and I work at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency right now. Thank you very much for your talks and for your contributions. It was wonderful and a privilege to be here.
Indeed.
My question is around collaborations, especially international collaborations. So I'm going to direct it to Frank, and maybe if you could add to that, would be great as well. So I was wondering about the lessons learned during international collaboration between North and South, and especially things that we should not do in the future. And as well, how should funders and governments support these in order to respond to grand challenges like infectious diseases or other challenges?
And grand challenges with a small g, I think we're talking about here.
Well, I think was asked a question at lunch, and the key word is partnership. You have to do it together as partners, and that, partners bring different things to the table, different skills, different opportunities, different ability to access money. So the project in Kenya has been a partnership between University of Nairobi, University of Manitoba, University of Washington, and University of Oxford and Ghent University. And each one has had different capacity. Like the Canadian side of it, we had the ability to get money for buildings, which you need buildings in which to work. The U.S. side, the University of Washington, through National Institutes of Health, the Fogarty Foundation, had funding opportunities for students. Oxford brought lots of expertise in immunology. Kenyans had access to populations and understanding of how their political and community systems worked. So all of those things I think are important to success, especially long-term success. Collaboration, in my estimation, works well if you bring complementary skills or abilities to the collaboration. It doesn't work that well when you both do the same thing, because then you end up more in competition than you do in collaboration. And I think it would be great if funding agencies would take that kind of thing into account. I think I think one of the things that we don't do very well is you have to be in it for the long term. You can't do it in 3 years, like through a normal, or 4 years through a normal grant. You need to be there for a long period of time. So you need sustainable persistence and sustainable funding.
Dr. Fauci?
I agree completely. Collaborations, when both parties of a collaboration get some benefit from it, and you've got to just make those collaborations almost before the fact. You have to develop relationships internationally so that you don't have to start from scratch when you have an issue. I mean, the issue, for example, with West Africa, with Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, was that because of the very difficult political situations in those countries, there weren't a lot of infrastructure collaborations that were in West Africa. It was brand new to them, and it was the perfect storm for an outbreak. Whereas in countries that you've had long-standing collaborations, like in Kenya and Uganda and South Africa, it was much more easy to respond to anything that would be an outbreak.
Thank you.
Heloise?
My name is Heloise Emden. I'm currently at Carleton University, but I used to be at IDRC, and I was in South Africa during the denialist phase. In fact, we used some IDRC funding, which was not even health funding. It was funding for information and communication technologies, to work with one of the provinces, the Free State province, to start an electronic medical record to track patients who were the first cohort to go on to antiretrovirals. And it was through, and I'm just responding to your idea of partnerships. It was through that partnership and through encouraging the recipient, who then was the Medical Research Council of South Africa, indirectly, to partner with others who were doing similar work, and they actually partnered with Indiana University, who was doing work at Moy University, and they started developing this record, electronic medical record, which I need to say IDRC's funding was really elemental at the very beginning to support someone from the Medical Research Council to step out of the council, because the council didn't want to do that work. And they had to step out, take a risk, start an enterprise, a social enterprise. And through partnering with different countries, different, let's call them, doctors who understood the power of information systems, they developed a system which to this day is running thanks to PEPFAR. Because the PEPFAR fund commissions many of the medical record systems that are held. And I mention this simply because I often think of the IDRC funding as very early venture capital, which kind of gets leveraged with other slower systems, but more sustained systems. So I'm just mentioning that as one example of how a small grant at a particular time can actually leverage ongoing programmatic work with extremely sustainable outcomes.
Thank you.
I would just second that in that we had initial funding from IDRC for a number of different projects, for chancroid, for ophthalmia neonatorum, for mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And that fostered, we haven't had IDRC funding for 20 years now, but that sort of started a lot of things that have been sustained over time through other funding sources.
Dr. Fauci, I was struck in Heloise's question with some of the stories I've heard you talk about online about the early days of working with AIDS activist communities and how those partnerships actually led to fairly dramatic change, I think. Right. So, did you want to say anything about that?
One of the most dramatic experiences that I've had was my experience with the activists in the United States, because they helped me to see things that transformed how we respond to emergencies like HIV/AIDS, because the rigidity of the scientific system and the rigidity of the regulatory system was not well suited to a disease that no one understood, that was killing people in a period of months, and regulatory process would not allow access to experimental drugs, because we were thinking in terms of the model of you have 10 drugs and you want an additional one. So if you have a clinical trial, there's exclusion criteria and inclusion criteria, and the federal government wasn't paying too much attention. So one of the things I was able to do was, despite the confrontative nature of the activist program, I started to listen to what they had to say, and what they had to say made a lot of sense, and it led to major changes in the regulatory system and the inclusion of activists in our planning programs of our clinical trial, which we never ever did before. The scientific community was very rigid, at least in the United States before then, that the scientists know best. And if you're a patient, thank you very much, but don't bother us because we need to do pure science, as opposed to realizing that if you don't design a clinical trial that's user-friendly, no one is going to benefit from it at all. So the activists did some rather draconian things to gain our attention. They were really very creative in that. They gained...
Certainly in your face.
They were, well, more than in my face. Larry Kramer, who some of you may know, is the iconic activist in the United States, prize-winning playwright and author, who was my big nemesis in the beginning. He got my attention by writing a front-page magazine section of the San Francisco Examiner in the late 1980s entitled, "I Call You a Murderer, an Open Letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci. So I try to keep that edition.
That framed,
I have
right?
that frame. I do. I have slides of it. I would have shown it. But the interesting thing, he got my attention. And now he's a very close personal friend of mine. He's a patient of mine. But he got our attention. And what he had to say, as well as some of the other activists, was very, very important.
Musa.
Thank you, Stephen. My name is Musa Mlongo. I'm a program officer here at IDRC. I did spend a few years at the Kenyan coast, and my training is in immunology, and so we were trying to do HIV immunology among high-risk groups in Mtwapa, in Mombasa area. I was up in Kilifi. And as scientists, our focus is get the samples, get the right number of people, get the right groups, bleed them, do the science. And we had a clinic in Mtwapa, which is a very, very progressive, so to speak, part of Kenya in terms of, it's a liberal tourist country, a town. So what happened is that the locals realized that we had a clinic that focused on sexually transmitted diseases, and we were starting to deal with gay men in a very, the Kenyan coast is mainly a very Muslim environment, and so we had a very big pushback from the community. It was a security issue, in fact. It was very chaotic for a few days because they were saying we were going there to teach men how to be gay. And so it took a year, together with the social scientists in Kilifi, to get them to understand and to support what we were trying to do, especially when we showed them data that most of the new infections were coming from men who were bisexual. And it was important that their wives and everybody else get to know what really is going on. And so that was to set the stage for this question. As scientists, as policy people, as epidemiologists, we look at problems very much through the prism of tools, infrastructure, capacity. But I think part of this capacity, especially in regions where stigma is a big issue, is there enough investment in your mind, in your thoughts about investment in terms of having social scientists play an even bigger role, because they understand societies, they understand how societies change, they understand the kind of work that needs to be done in terms of community engagement before all the other interventions come in. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's enough money going into that? And do you think what should be done about that?
Thank you. That social scientists know what's going on in societies. It would be a mystery to me, but as a social scientist myself. So, Dr. Fauci.
I don't want to short shift what you're saying, but the reality is that, the good news is that there is a role for social science studies in this. The bad news is I'm not so sure that it's going to be even slightly successful in changing anything that's ingrained in society, from religious, cultural, and ethnic beliefs that go back centuries. I think social science investment, I'd rather invest in a vaccine than that.
You're incredibly positive. Dr. Plummer.
No, I appreciate the problem. We've encountered similar things in working with female sex workers largely, but also male sex workers. You just have to proceed carefully and slowly with that kind of thing. There's no magic solution. Having social scientists involved is great, and they can help design programs, but studying the problem is not going to solve it. You have to work with the people who are protesting or participants or whatever it is. It really takes working with the people.
Well, one addition to that is that when we put a lot of money into Uganda through PEPFAR and through science funding, and as you recall, a little while ago, they brought up the idea of not only illegal to be homosexual, but you could be actually executed for being homosexual. So we got very upset about that. So the only stick that we had was, if you don't change that, we're not going to give you any money. And the answer was, don't give us any money.
We had Canada had the same problem. We did the same thing.
So, our big leverage was complete because we obviously were not going to not fund them because we needed to fund them. But I only give it as an example that those kinds of cultural issues are very difficult to change.
Please.
Let me start by thanking
Could you say who you are?
Sorry, well, I'm secondary. Thank you, both of you, for the contributions you've made, and certainly you've been an inspiration to all of us. My name is Rob Cushman. I used to be the medical officer of health here in Ottawa, but more to the point, I worked 3 years at St. Francis Hospital in Zambia on the Malawi border in the early 80s. I think we've jumped into one question here, but first of all, to you, Dr. Fauci, is there any, I won't ask you to speculate about the new regime, but is there any evidence that Obamacare has actually improved access? And my second question is sort of drifting in where we've just been. Frank, one of the things I'm really impressed with is not only your science, but also your community engagement. And can we put you on the spot? Is there any one or two learnings you think from that experience which might be generalizable to the rest of us?
And I'm going to take our last question at the same time, and then we'll go back to both our speakers.
We'll have to try to fit them together. My name is Ute Gerbrand. As Frank already indicated, I'm a former CEDA employee. While I was here in Ottawa, I was the program manager for the Strengthening STD HIV AIDS Control Program in Kenya. And when I was posted to the High Commission there as First Secretary of Development, I was the liaison officer. I spent 4 years there, so I really got to know the program because I was responsible for the program. And I wanted to say you've come a long way, because when I was there, those 4 years, the only help for, I love the word, the definition for commercial sex workers as opposed to prostitutes. That made a difference in how people saw them. But all they had was the condom. And to get men to accept the condom was a very difficult task, because men did not feel, or men felt that the condom wasn't big enough for them. And so that was a big obstacle. I know it sounds hilarious, but it was. And so teaching the women, and what the women did, thanks to the community efforts that both the University of Nairobi and Manitoba did, is many of the commercial sex workers lived in communities, in the compounds. So if a client wanted to have some service, and he would go to the first sex worker, and she would say yes with a condom, and he didn't want that, he would try the next. But they had made a commitment that they would all ask for the condom, and so he had to decide whether he wanted it or not. So knowing all of this stuff, I drove around everywhere with big boxes of condoms, because I was trying to help people to recognize that that could make a difference. And promiscuity was a big issue, because a man would have a country wife, a city wife, and a relationship with a sex worker. So you had all of those problematics with sexually transmitted diseases. And it was the discrimination and the stigma did not go away. And I think until the government and the people, and through the traditions, they accept the reality of diseases being transmitted sexually, you're not going to have much improvement in the health system for that problem, because that is still a cultural issue. In Uganda, where I also worked, the death penalty is real. Yeah. The churches, the communities.
Okay, have you got a question?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to know how much effort is there now in terms of the research, the health work, in terms of reaching out to the communities so that they better accept that this is a problem, and that they help people to minimize the stigma and the discrimination so that they can get the help they need.
Thank you very much. Welcome to IDRC. Frank.
I don't know how much effort has been done, to tell you the truth. I mean, we do a fair bit with the people that we work with, but we don't do it at the level of the whole community, although we try to educate leaders, and some of them buy in, some of them don't. What we're successful in doing in the sex worker communities we work with is to do exactly what you said. You get the community as a whole to make a decision rather than leave it up to the individual whether condoms should be used or not. And that's worked pretty well. We've been able to get condom use from 0 to around 80% in certain sex worker communities in Nairobi. And that's worked elsewhere too. It's worked in Calcutta, it's worked in Cambodia, it's worked in Thailand, worked in other areas of India where Manitoba's been doing work. So it's a very effective strategy, but it needs to be taken to scale at country levels. And that's not a simple thing, and you need quite a bit of money to do that. And maybe I'll try to address Rob's question about, forget what it was. Rob? Lessons you learned. Oh, yeah. No, it's about partnership, and it's about building communities. With the sex workers, we essentially had to build a community. So with some leadership from ourselves and Kenyan colleagues, we created a community of sex workers who worked together and who had solidarity with each other, who began to help each other more and more, began to look after each other when they were sick, look after their kids, that kind of thing. So we actually had to more or less create a community, and so that's a strategy that we've used successfully in other areas of Nairobi and exported to India and other places. So that would be a key one. And it's also listening to people's problems. We have the areas that we work in Nairobi, we have a community liaison group which meets regularly with the medical team or the clinical team that tells us about what they're concerned about and asks for help in certain areas. Well, some things we can help with, but some things are just beyond our control or beyond our ability to fund. So we listen and we're sympathetic and we try to address their issues. There's a good example from Calcutta, where they started a sex worker project. There was a lot of sex work. There wasn't much HIV, but they created a community of sex workers, and these women started to work on other things other than the problems associated with sex work. So they started to look how to get clean water, how to look after each other's children, other types of employment, and they did that spontaneously. So you need to kind of create a community, I think, in order to move some of these things forward.
Dr. Fauci, last quotes.
Yeah. So you asked about the Affordable Care Act. Has it really increased access? And the answer is yes, very much so. However, the reason why it's still a controversy in the United States is at what cost. So prior to the Affordable Care Act, there were 15 to 20 million people who had no health insurance. In addition, people could be excluded from insurance because of pre-existing conditions. So what the Affordable Care Act did is that it allowed everybody to have insurance, and you can't exclude somebody. Now, the problem is that costs money, and the way the plan was developed to pay for that was to say that if you make health insurance mandatory, hence the mandate, that young, healthy people would get health insurance but would never have to use it. That would make up for the additional money that would be called upon for people who wouldn't have insurance or who have pre-existing conditions. The trouble is the young, healthy people were not signing up for the insurance, and so the inflow of money to balance the other wasn't coming in. So what actually happened is that the premiums went up. So one of the ways to get that down is to make it much more compelling for young people to buy insurance, because if they don't because they don't need it or think they need it, then you're never going to be able to pay for the others. So we definitely have greater access, except that it's costing more money.
So the incentive systems aren't quite right.
Exactly.
And they're all state-wise and quite differentiated as well.
Yes.
So. Well, please join me in offering great thanks to Dr. Frank Plummer, Dr. Anthony Fauci, two of the most preeminent public servants of the world over the last half century.